Thank you. I'll be honest with you. When Nigeria announced that they were going into a full lockdown, I was quite surprised because for some really wild, unreasonable hope, I had this idea that maybe this COVID that we've been hearing about for months is not going to affect us. It's not going to reach Nigeria. Insane. It did. Lagos announced their own lockdown. I was, at the time, in early March, I was visiting my mother in the States, and I knew that I just had to come home, not just because I couldn't really bear the idea of being locked in with my mother for an indefinite amount of time, but also because I had been sent out to just cover a story on the early rolling out of really what Lagos looked down in this early lockdown period. So this particular image I took with my iPhone, actually, it was just me getting right on ground at the airport and seeing these procedures being just carried out in terms of contact tracing, which was a method that was very effective for us back in Ebola time and very successful as a country with handling that and slowing it down considerably. So even just little things like handing out hand sanitizer to people coming out of the planes was very instrumental with just slowing down our COVID cases. I can look here, fantastic. As we hit the streets, you would see these like large informational signboards put everywhere, and these were efforts by both the public and private health sectors, really because there's this well-known mistrust that we have of our government, and a lot of people simply did not believe that COVID was a thing. You know, you cannot believe what you don't see. It was also called a rich man's disease by the masses, where people said, it's only affecting the rich people, it's not affecting us. So there was really a push to just put out this information as heavily as possible. Part of how the lockdown was enforced was really through this like roadblocks everywhere that ensured that only essential workers were moving around at that time. And now the city, and this is a population of over 22 million people and growing on the smallest landmass in the country. And just really, in a couple of hours, the city just went quiet. And this was just a very surreal thing to bear witness to. Places like this, which is called Marina, it's one of our major business points where the corporate buildings are, our marketplaces are. This space would have been completely jam-packed with cars, but had just been converted to this impromptu football field. Well, not really much of a field, by young men who, back before the lockdown, would make a daily living of just kind of like parking cars and just doing their regular day-in, day-out hustles. Places like Balogun Market, which is one of our largest markets in the city. And I wish I could show you what this place normally looks like, because you can't walk in without, someone ramming into your shoulders. And as a photographer who has tried to photograph this place many times, in the past you walk in and people are yelling at you, saying, hey, don't point your camera here. And in this case, I kind of miss that sort of anxiety it would give me on a regular day. Iconic streets, really, to Nigerians were laid completely empty. Major bus stations that would just have lines and lines of people was dead quiet. And in this time of silence, there was this also realization, at least for me, that Lagos is a city that is not meant to be still. And in that stillness came a lot of tension. I would walk out on the street and you just see individuals kind of glowering in corners. And it was these tensions that, well, really for issues that have always been in Nigeria, but with people now having this enforced extra time, really, to think about why our conditions like this. You have the majority of Nigerians who are daily wage earners, now unable to go out and make money to actually eat. You feel that tension. And some of the tensions that bubbled up took place in the form of the EndSARS movement. Now, the EndSARS movement has been around since 2017, took off primarily with Twitter, and young Nigerians coming up and saying that we are tired of police brutality. In 2020 of October, it really kind of boiled over when young Nigerian men in particular were still being killed based off how they looked, how they dressed. This is a narrative that we are not completely unfamiliar with. And the Nigerian youth decided, you know what, enough is enough. So they mobilized themselves. They got on Twitter and said, all right, guys, this is where we're going to meet. We're going to march to the deputy governor's house, and we are going to state our grievances, and we are going to state what we want. And for me at that time, it was, in a way, happening in my backyard. I could hear the chants, and I decided, well, as a photojournalist, this is certainly something that I should go out and document. But when I went out, what I saw were familiar faces. I saw my friends, I saw friends of friends, I saw recognizable activists. I saw people in my community frustrated and tired over an issue that I too was very familiar with. So as someone who, normally when I'm working, I am aware that I'm very much a visitor in a lot of spaces. But in this case, I was not. This is my community. These are issues that I care about. So I moved from being someone who just wanted to bear witness as a photojournalist to a protester who just so happened to have a camera around. So these are some of the images from the early protests that slowly grew to become hundreds of thousands of people gathering. I remember trying to keep quiet and just, once again, still bear witness, but by the end of this particular protest, I was joining in, chanting EndSARS, marching with people, and just really feeling part of the community. A point to make about these protests is that they were completely peaceful, which is something that if you take time to see what the Nigerian government is saying, they're not quite saying the same thing. The only violence that came in the time of these protests were state-sanctioned, where at the end, in the evenings of the protests, we would know that armed officers would show up to try and break the crowds, and naturally people would panic and run, and some people would get injured, and some people would get hit by a stray bullet, or not, and some people would die. But what is important for me to talk about here is that we all know images from protests. We all know about protests. We've all seen these images of people kind of shouting and loud crowds and maybe someone standing in front of some sort of militant figure. We've seen fires. We've seen someone throwing something. And what is important for me to talk about is really the culture of the EndSARS movement, what it was really like just outside of the chanting and the marching. For us, scenes like this, as a lot of us in Nigeria grew up during a military coup, under a military regime, it's not unfamiliar to see sights like this. But now, personally, looking back at an image like this, it was kind of a dark telling of what is to come, where I photographed tired protesters, and above them is this sort of like looming figure of danger, really. The culture of the EndSARS is, once again, important for me to say because so many interesting figures and really interesting people arose from that. We have individuals like Flag Boy here, and his name kind of stuck, who was this mysterious masked young boy that would show up at all different locations, waving this flag, just kind of motivating people to carry on, and everybody is tired. We're there for hours on end of the day, but then you just see this young boy now climbing a large statue and waving that flag relentlessly, and the flag never once touching the ground. The protests themselves were quite organized in the sense of, even though we were creating a lot of traffic around the city and people were getting stuck in places, there were temporary blocks. And something that we would shout to people while they waited hours in traffic is, we are sorry for the inconvenience, we are trying to change Nigeria. And people loved it, people were in their car, like even after 3 hours sitting in traffic saying, yes, this is great, we've never seen something like this. People were honking their cars in support, throwing their fists out in the car as well. Recognizable cultural icons came up. Fela Kuti was everywhere. His music was playing. People were dancing dancing in the streets. This particular image was taken at the Lekki toll gate, which is a major toll gate intersection for just businesses that in the days and really weeks of the Lagos protest sit-in, allegedly cost the Lagos state government billions in naira within 2 weeks. Where that money goes, we never see it anyway, so it didn't really touch us. The sense of community was further enforced with these images where even on a Friday, we were in front of the governor's office posing a sit-in, and all the music was turned off and the space was cleared so that our Muslim brothers and sisters could observe their Friday prayers. These images, I believe, are important just so that people can actually see more of an intimate view of what happens at protests. At the end of all these protests, what did the Nigerian youth do? They cleaned up after themselves. They picked up every piece of trash that was around. Food and water was regularly provided. And this is why also the Nigerian government is currently trying to implement a social media ban, because everything that happened from the protests came from using platforms like Twitter, where people would say, hey, we are currently at the Lekki toll gates, there's no food, there is no water, and people would show up and provide. Here's a scene of the Lekki toll gate at night where night vigils were held to just memorialize the people who had died at the hands of NSAS. This is an image that I would really call an armpit image of the sort of crowds that showed up at the Lekki toll gate. 2 days after this image was taken, the state governor issued a 4 p.m. curfew at 12 noon, later on extended it into 9 p.m. At 6:52 p.m., I remember this very well because I had chosen not to go out that day because my knee hurts. At 6:52 p.m., the Nigerian military showed up, waited until it got dark, turned off the Lekki toll gate lights, which never happened, and fired into the crowd of sit-in protesters who had been singing the national anthem and waving the Nigerian flag, thus bringing an end to the physical element of the NSAS movement. I just really want to quickly talk that even though there were no recognizable leaders in this, at every protest I went to, it was the women standing in front, motivating people, organizing people, keeping the energy going, the crowd going. And personally to me, these images are representative of what the Nigerian youth were capable of doing in the middle of a pandemic, despite the risk to themselves, and is a reminder that it's not quite yet over. Thank you.